Hi, everyone. FYI, this episode of Silvacast is being recorded virtually. It is a pandemic after all, so please excuse any funky audio issues. You know what I mean. Welcome to Silvacast, the podcast about all things silviculture. Our goal each episode is to bring you discussion, ideas, and information you can use as foresters and land managers. I'm Greg Edge.
And I'm Brad Hutnick.
And we're both silviculturists with Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry and your hosts for today's show. So, Brad, welcome to episode 4.
How are you doing, Greg?
I'm doing fine. And I was thinking about something last night. I was thinking that every time we do one of these episodes, we learn something.
That's kind of the cool part, isn't it? I mean, if you had asked me in episode 1 what we would be talking about in episode 4, I wouldn't have guessed I would have learned as much by this point as I have about podcasting.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a creative process, and one thing I learned is we really cannot act to save ourselves. So when we try to script something, it just sounds terrible.
Yeah, and so I think this all goes back, Greg, to the genesis of this is us sitting around with a drink saying, and then you talk about something for 3 hours. You go, man, that was a great conversation. And it's so hard. You don't script those conversations, right?
Yeah.
This is more like, hey, this is just this is seat of the pants. What's important? What are we talking about? And I agree with you completely. The thing I learned is I am not very good with the script.
Yeah, and then so just so people know, we've tried to write these scripts and it just kind of comes out like, oh, look, Brad, we have a guest. Welcome, Dan.
Who could that be at the door?
Welcome to Silvacast.
Yeah.
So from now on, we should just wing it. That's
or we just have to, I think you just have to accept that, a lot of the questions we have we just have to be organic with them. They have to spring up. They can't just be something that like we get from somebody else or it's delivered. So, and I'm okay with that. I mean, it's kind of, you're riding an edge with that too, right? I mean, sometimes it's like really good, sometimes it's not, but hey, that's life.
And here's my scripted segue. So if you want to just talk off the top of your head with a forester, you can bring up the topic of oak, right?
Yeah.
Because I've been with the DNR for 28 years and we've been talking about oak that whole time. And so it's still a high interest subject with our foresters. And that's what today's topic is going to be, right?
That's right. Let's get down to business.
So today, we're fortunate to be speaking with our friend and colleague, Dan Dey. Dan is a research forester with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station, specializing in forest regeneration issues in the hardwood-dominated ecosystems of the eastern United States.
Dan has done a lot of really great work on a variety of applied silvicultural issues. Many of you may be familiar with the work Dan has done with bottomland hardwoods, and even recently with Menominee Tribal Enterprises on northern hardwood management issues. What stands out to me, however, is Dan's work on oak silviculture. Dan is, Greg, you would, I think, agree, our go-to silviculturist on oak issues. Today we'll be talking to Dan about what brought him to oak research, what leads to success, and just as importantly, what leads to failure when we're trying to regenerate oak, and what tools we should be considering adding to our silvicultural toolkit.
Hey, that wasn't bad for reading a script, was it?
Practice makes perfect.
Practice makes perfect.
Perfect.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll read a little script here and there.
Yeah.
But first, we got to have our sponsor today. What is it, Brad?
Today's episode of Silvacast is brought to you by Humdrum Increment Borers. Next time you want to be boring in increments, get a humdrum.
Excellent.
See, now that's a script I could use.
So, welcome to Silvacast, Dan Dey. It's nice to have you here. We get to see you once in a while way up here in Wisconsin, but these days it's kind of hard to come by. So it's good to talk to you, even if it's online.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to see you and hear your voice, and I certainly do miss my visits up in Wisconsin.
Yep. Now, Dan, rumor has it you're originally from Wisconsin.
Yeah, when I was about 10, I traveled with the family along the caravan trails from North Carolina to Brown Deer, Wisconsin.
Brown Deer. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was just a brand new suburb, pushing out into the cornfields at the time.
Wow.
That was when you were
we're
10,
claiming
Dan?
you now. That's
Yeah.
it. We're claiming you as a Badger now.
I call it the formative years from 10 to 18.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Those are important years.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can only imagine what growing up in Wisconsin, taking that part of only living in Wisconsin will do for a person, though, too.
Yeah.
So, but then wait a minute. Did you go to forestry school when you turned 18 or?
Well, my parents moved back to their home in Missouri, and I just followed them at the time. And so I went to the University of Missouri.
Oh, okay.
Although my best friend in high school went to Stevens Point,
Well,
and I was,
yeah,
I was on the
okay.
verge of following him there.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. No points? Oh, come on.
No.
So Dan, can you just tell us a little bit about where you work now and just what you do?
Yeah, right now I'm a research forester with the U.S. Forest Service. I'm part of the Northern Research Station, which goes from Missouri to Minnesota to Maine down to West Virginia. And so I think it's a really nice piece of the country to work in. I've been part of the Forest Service research team here since 1998. And before that, I've been in forestry since 1979. And I had 8 years practicing as a forester with the U.S. Forest Service in Alaska and Idaho.
Oh, okay.
And I think that's been really important for me to have that kind of practical on the ground forestry experience I think it really gives me a different perspective and approach to research. It's much more applied and problem solving than, other scientists you might run into.
And is your research group down there, are you associated with the university?
Well, we're on the University of Missouri campus, and most of us have, a courtesy appointments with the university that allow us to serve on graduate committees. But we do have a research unit there, and I'm also the leader of that. And it's a combination of forestry and wildlife scientists who do work in bats, songbirds, soils, landscape management, and silviculture.
Yeah. And I know your work has been really diverse, Dan. That's what I've always appreciated looking at your stuff. You've done a lot in bottomland hardwoods. I really appreciated, I saw a paper you did with on northern hardwoods here in Wisconsin. But it seems like a lot, like the stuff that we've really dug into a lot is your stuff on oak. What brought you to kind of research on oak management?
Well, when I left the Forest Service in Idaho, I happened to come back to the University of Missouri to do my PhD. And it just so happens that my project ended up letting me work with Paul Johnson. And if you're in the world of oak, you know that name, Paul Johnson. He's the senior author on the Oak Bible, the Ecology and Silviculture of Oak. The third edition just came out this past year, and I was honored to be a part of that update. And so that's where, certainly my education in Missouri, gave me some foundations in oak ecosystems, ecology, and silviculture, but it really started in the world of research working with Paul Johnson.
Wow.
That's neat.
And so I'm sorry, Greg.
Oh, I was just going to say, we have a couple of Paul Johnson studies just right around La Crosse here where I'm at. So it's
he grew up in the Washburn area, so that's God's country to him. He's very much a, cheesehead.
Yeah. Yeah. Bob Rogers was involved in a lot of that work too, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. They were colleagues together, and then Bob went up to be on the faculty, and then the whatever dean or director of the natural resources department at Stevens Point, and finished his career there.
Wow. So your work with oak right now, Dan, we've been digging into this, and I know Greg and I get tons of questions on oak management, and it seems like, every time we go into the field, whether it's northern Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin, we always want to talk about other types, but when it comes down to questions, they really, really want to know about oak. So your work is in kind of that central part of the United States. Do you see differences in the way oak is treated in different parts of the country, and maybe some of the similarities or differences in how we approach oak?
Yeah, there's a lot more similarities in how we treat oak and what the oak problems are than there are differences. But there are differences definitely, and especially when you consider, the entire eastern U.S. You have differences in climate, soils, geology. You all experienced glaciation, other people didn't. That affected, the landscape that oak's trying to grow on. And then there may have been, different human history, land history, differences that created different starting conditions. But there are real general patterns too. Deer browsing is a major problem. A lot of our oak forests are in the same condition in the sense that there's maybe oak is a dominant mature tree in the overstory. There may be some small seedlings in the advanced reproduction, but there's nothing in between. So there's no evidence that the seedlings are recruiting periodically up into the overstory. And then there's always competing vegetation, and of course that's another difference too. I mean, if in some areas you have aspen or yellow poplar or sugar maple, and red maple's quite widespread, but the suite of competitors can change, and that would affect it. Not only is part of the problem of oak regeneration, but it also affects how you might approach solving that. When you move, there's other more human or social factors that may change too. Depending on where you live, there's different state forestry laws and practices, or different social restrictions on what kind of silvicultural practices you can use. Herbicides, clear cutting, things like that will vary across regions or within even a state. And so there's those kinds of human differences too.
Yeah, I know here in Wisconsin, I was going to say that we have differences in markets too. So what you can cut and kind of what practices you can do vary across the state depending on those markets. So that sometimes impacts our work.
That's a huge factor. And, a lot of what goes into successful oak regeneration is work that costs money. It's not there. I mean, the commercial timber harvest or a commercial thinning is part of it, but there's a lot of other work dealing with non-commercial size stems or competing vegetation or trying to combat deer browsing. Just all of those things cost money. And so the more markets you have to make more of the work profitable, or at least break even, it's very helpful.
Yeah.
Would you say that's so you have this broad wealth of experience, you can take a look at the entire country. Is that common across maybe the country, that we have those problems with the necessary requirement that we do a lot of that pre-work, kind of the stuff you were just talking about for oak?
Right. Our forest in general, this is a common problem. They're too dense, and that creates low light conditions in the understory, which makes it hard for oak seedlings to persist and survive and to grow into a larger, more competitive seedling.
If you had to say, like, why is oak regeneration failing in many cases, what would those main things be that you would say?
So when we think about the regeneration potential of any species, and thinking of it in terms of oak, you start by thinking of what are the sources of reproduction, and we commonly recognize new seedlings, advanced reproduction, and stump sprouts from the overstory after a harvest. And new oak seedlings have very slow juvenile growth. So they're often quickly overtopped after a regeneration release by well-developed and large shade-tolerant species or by very fast-growing pioneer species. And so they just get suppressed and die out under the shade of those developing canopies. And then over the years, we've learned that not all big oak trees produce stump sprouts. And so if your goal is to maintain oak stocking at the current level or to increase it, you're not going to get there by relying completely on stump sprouts. And so that's why in oak silviculture, we always say the key is having adequate, large advanced reproduction, meaning competitive seedlings that can, persist and maintain dominance in the new stand. Now that usually a common problem is we often treat regeneration as an event, and we don't think about it until we're ready to regenerate and do the commercial harvest. And that's too late to start dealing with a stand that has low oak regeneration potential. You need to have started 10 or more years before that, preparing a population of large advanced reproduction of oak in the understory before you really release it. So it sounds silly, but sometimes I've been out, walking around with a forester, and they read somewhere where shelter woods are good for regenerating oak. So they did a shelter wood, and then they asked me what I think. And I go, well, it's a nice looking shelter wood, but where's the oak that you released? And, it wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
So they released a whole bunch of red maple or sugar maple or beech, and they've just made the problem worse.
Yeah.
So we think too much in a single event, we get into a mindset of thinking about just the regeneration harvest, and we need to be thinking about regeneration as a process that is kind of a continuous thing that occurs over decades, and we have to prepare for it to be more successful.
So if we have to set that stand up to develop that advanced regeneration ahead of time, so what are those practices that we can do to get that advanced regeneration to develop? Because as you said, in a lot of these stands, they're dense and most of the oak regen just blinks out.
Yeah. Well, in a situation like that, you may have certainly less than 5% of full sunlight, and that's not enough light for really any of the oak species to survive and to grow. So you need to increase light, and luckily we have control over that because the interceptors of light are the overstory and a midstory and maybe a heavy shrub layer. And we can manage that vegetation to control the light levels, to get them in a range where we want them. So if you have a midstory, a shade tolerant midstory, and we commonly do in a lot of our forests, you might think about starting there by doing some kind of midstory removal. You're not really removing it, you're removing the midstory. A lot of times, depending on how you do that, those stems will sprout. So you're increasing stem density in the reproduction layer, but at least you've gotten rid of that mid-story canopy. And you can do that by herbicides, and there's several ways of applying those. A common one is to do what we call hack and spray, where you use a hatchet and a little squirt bottle of herbicide and take individual stems out. That keeps them, if it's effective, from sprouting. And another very effective tool is prescribed fire. That prescribed fire, especially the dormant season, low intensity fires that are really common, are capable of at least top killing hardwood stems up around 4 inches in diameter at the ground line. And so as long as your mid-story isn't larger than that, prescribed fire is a good way of eliminating or greatly reducing a mid-story canopy. And when you take that out, you're going to increase light up to about 10 or 15% of full sunlight. That's a real common result of taking a mid-story out in many, many places across the eastern US. And that's moving in the right direction. The oaks will benefit from that. They'll survive better. They'll start growing a little bit. But for really good growth, you want to be in the light range of 30 to 50% of full sunlight. And that requires starting to thin the overstory canopy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the shelterwood system is often recommended, because it is so flexible to, depending on how intense your shelterwood harvest is, or you can regulate how much light is in the understory, and you can do that over several stages, which the traditional shelterwood method, accommodates for. So it's often doing the mid-story control either in conjunction with the shelterwood harvest or maybe prior to.
Mm-hmm. That was a question I had, Dan. Should that mid-story removal be done when you have, say, a good acorn crop and you have new germinants on the ground, or can you do that when you don't have anything yet and just then wait for a good acorn crop and new germinants to develop, or do you need that to happen simultaneously?
Well, it kind of depends, I guess, on how you're doing it and what else is on the ground. And so if you don't have oaks there to begin with, then what are you releasing? If there's a lot of heavy competition in the seedling layer, advanced reproduction seedling sprout layer, you're releasing that. I mean, they will benefit from the 10 or 15% of full sunlight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so if you're using periodic prescribed burning, you can reduce the mid-story, and it also knocks the seedling layer back. And then if you aren't getting an acorn crop in a timely manner, you can apply fire again, and you can kind of use fire to just keep the understory in check, and until you get the oak seedlings established. And then you would want to not burn for a little while, a few years, because acorns and young oak seedlings, small oak seedlings, are as vulnerable as any other species to being killed by fire.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really cool, Dan, because it kind of sounds to me like, because I think traditionally we've always thought about breaking apart like a tending phase in management for a stand and a regeneration phase. And it sounds like we need to, as part of that tending, we need to be setting the stage for management, or setting the stage for regeneration, with that kind of increasing light availability, mid-story removal, and then competition control, which I think a lot of us have, we kind of improve the quality of the trees, we improve the stocking, we do stuff like that, but we don't think ahead, 2 steps to make sure we're getting that stuff in place.
I think, as you said, Dan, too, we tend to think about regeneration when we're ready to harvest timber, and we haven't done all of that kind of monitoring and preparation to get that advanced regen.
It takes good oak reproduction, takes commitment over time, and that speaks to kind of another challenge, because of course the private landowners own most of the resource, and I think I've seen articles where the average landowner tenure of private landowners is 7 years or 10 years or something like that. So every 10 years you got a new landowner, and with a different set of objectives and priorities. I don't know what the tenure is in the Wisconsin DNR or other state or federal agencies, but staff move around, and it's there needs to be an institutional commitment and archiving of the plan, the long-term plan, and there needs to be buy-in by the new staff coming in. That's important, and I'm going to carry this forward as a good steward. And any one of those places are weak links in a chain, and the whole long-term prescription can fall apart.
Yeah. So what if you're a landowner, maybe more appropriately a forester, who walks into a situation where they want to start they need to do the shelterwood, or there's a reason they have to start their management now, so they haven't done the pre-work. Can they still do things like, say, mid-story removal with planting or something else in order to maybe give them a better chance as they go forward? Because I think a lot of our foresters are going to say, this is great, except I haven't done any of that back work. Now what do I do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a real good point, and there's always two sides to the coin. So to back up just a little bit, working ahead of time, incrementally increasing the light. That's kind of a cautious approach to, and one reason people do it is because there are, especially the fast growing pioneer species out there, that are shade intolerant and fast growing. And so you're trying to give oak enough light, but not invigorate the fast growing shade intolerant species. And so you're trying to use the overstory shade as a form of vegetation control in the understory. Now that incremental increase in light does help oak, but really, I mean, if you just think of what's best for the oak, you want to give it more than 10 or 15% of full sunlight. You want to give it 30 or 50% of full sunlight, or more, depending on the species. And if you do that, you're going to unleash all the other competing vegetation. But that's okay if you're ready and committed to doing vegetation management after release. So one approach is to incrementally increase the light, mid-story removal, 10 years before the final harvest, waiting for a good acorn crop. But another approach is, if you have oak in the understory, then to release it. But you better be prepared, and you better be monitoring, and within 2 or 3 years, you're probably, as that regeneration layer starts closing in on the oaks, you're going to have to do something. And at that point, herbicides gets a little bit tough because they're not selective, whether it's an oak or a maple or whatever. They're all vulnerable to many of the approved herbicides we can use. Prescribed fire is a really good tool at that time, but you have to do something. You have mechanical, you can kind of think of it as crop tree release, at regeneration, to go out and single out oak reproduction across the site and release them mechanically with herbicides, or just release the whole site by burning it.
Yeah. Do you see differences? We kind of talk about oak like it's a monolith, but do you see differences between oak species and how this works?
Oh, absolutely. And that's something I have to keep reminding myself, that we have something like 90 oak species in the U.S. I forget how many are, in the East. How many oak species do you have in Wisconsin? They're not all the same. So there's differences in shade tolerance. Quercus alba, white oak, is one of the more shade tolerant oak species. Northern red oak, black oak are, kind of relatively intermediate to that. And then scarlet and post oak are very shade intolerant. So, I mean, within oaks, you have a wide range of shade tolerance, and that affects how you would approach managing light in the woody structure, the overstory and the midstory, depending on what oak species you're wanting to favor or you have to work with. There's differences in early growth rates. Scarlet oak, northern red oak, they have relatively fast early growth, and white oak and post oak and bur oak are much slower. That affects a lot of things. That affects their ability to compete over time in a young stand. That affects how quickly they develop bark thickness, and that's very important when it comes to prescribed burning. The thickness of the bark protects the cambium from being killed by the heat of any kind of fire. And as bark thickness increases, the protection of the cambium increases exponentially. So that's really important. And in general, when any tree grows larger, its bark gets thicker. Now there's differences among species as to how fast that happens and to how thick it eventually gets. And so like a silver maple never really has thick bark. Cottonwood gets very thick bark. Bur oak gets very thick bark. Among the oaks, there's differences in just that the rate of bark thickness and the amount of bark thickness.
I know, Dan, you I think had worked on a recent paper with others about some of that damage to oak caused by fire and economic considerations with that. So what's the long and the short of that? Do we need to worry about economic loss with the use of prescribed fire in these oak stands?
Well, fire is a potential threat to the economic value of trees, definitely. The potential is there. And the more we understand it, the more we understand what its impact is, the better we can make decisions about, either protecting a forest from wildfire or the use of prescribed burning and how we use it, prescribed fire. And we can minimize the negative impacts. So, I mean, in a nutshell, number one, when I was a forester growing up and being trained in the 1970s, it was get the fire out of the woods and get the cattle out of the woods.
Right.
That was forestry
Yeah.
101. And so fire, I grew up as, being trained fire is evil. And certainly a lot of our oak forest that were developing from the 1930s, the recovery of the forest right after the first logging boom, there was a lot of fire, intense fire burning in extensive heavy slash loadings. And so they were hot fires, and they caused large damage, severe damage to trees. And there was a lot of rot and decay over the decades that followed from that. And the point is I want to make is that prescribed burning that we do today is not like those kind of wildfires after the initial settlement. And so there's a lot less risk of a prescribed fire severely injuring a tree. Now, where you see that happening most is where there's some kind of heavy fuel loads up against your residual trees, and you can get a severe scar from that. But that's something you can manage, and there's Pat Brose did a study where, if he was able to pull the slash 6 feet away from the tree, that pretty much reduced the threat of scarring that tree. So, in the logging and thinning, you can, have some slash requirements around residual trees and manage that. But there are some new studies, and I just encourage you to keep your eye on the literature, because a paper just came out a couple months ago. People are paying more attention in research about trying to quantify the damage. And so one of the first modern studies was by Joe Marshall, and he looked at fire effects on the value and volume in red oaks in Missouri. And these are trees that were 10 inches in diameter or larger when they were first scarred. And this is 15 years after, up to 15 years after the tree was scarred. And what he found was there was about a 3 or 4% reduction in volume and a 10% reduction in value. So there is this, it really wasn't that bad. And I don't know if a 10% reduction in value scares you, but I guess at least you have that information to make a decision whether I want to give that up or not. Yeah. And you have to ask, is that worth what I gained from the prescribed fire?
Well, especially if you're going to be investing in that long-term management like you described. You might lose 10% on that end, but if you're investing it kind of on that other side, it could be a wash. You might be easier to regenerate oak with the presence of fire over that long period of time. The 10% might actually be cheap in that situation.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, from the fire, you're able to manage the seed bed to reduce deep litter layers and improve oak germination and seedling establishment. You can start exhausting the seed bank of competing species. You're knocking out the mid-story and the understory, at least knocking it back. And there's just a lot of other ecological benefits to that. I'm concentrating on trees right now, but there's native biodiversity, ground flora benefits. There's maybe wildlife habitat benefits that only fire can give you. So is all of that worth 10% loss in value at commercial harvest? You have to answer that.
Mm-hmm. From time to time, Dan, we actually do have a listener or two, and we get a question. And we have this thing called the drop box. Well, this isn't the drop box right now, but this is a really relevant conversation about the use of fire in a forester's toolbox for oak. And we have a listener, Jess, way out in Vermont, which is, I think, really cool. And Jess is wondering about the use of fire in that toolbox in terms of, how widespread are we going to be able to use fire across the landscape to manage these oak stands? So kind of that social aspect. And then two, a lot of these stands, as you said, have become denser. They've become more mesic. And so is it going to be more difficult to apply fire within those stands?
Yeah, well, that's a real good point, because, historically, a lot of the eastern landscape had some kind of frequent fire. Maybe it was every 10 years, every 20 years, or every 2 years, depending on if you're in southern Florida or southern Texas or in Wisconsin. And so, you know, that led to the widespread distribution and dominance of pines and oaks in the eastern US and other fire adapted species. And so now, you know, we've pretty much eliminated fire from the landscape, and the forests have changed, not in a good way for oaks anyways, or pines. And so we have a widespread landscape problem, but we aren't able or ready yet or capable now of using fire on that large landscape. So, I mean, fire's not going to be able, for many reasons, to solve the landscape issue of fire and other fire adapted communities. And we are, in terms of agencies, state and federal and conservation organizations, we're starting to, you know, have more interest in prescribed burning, learning how to do it, starting to slowly increase the amount of acres we're treating, but it's still a drop in a bucket for what the problem is. And then there's maybe the social issues of smoke problems and human health, and you know, maybe just public perception is negative against fire, or they're fearful of. So yeah, there's all those social constraints to using prescribed fire. Those are things that can change over time with good education, outreach, and, you know, making people aware of the history, the current role of fire, and what are some of the alternatives. I mean, there are alternatives. They don't all address equally the things that fire can address, but fire is never the silver bullet alone. It's always used in combination with other practices, herbicides, timber cutting, thinning, hack and spray, whatever. It all goes together. And it can be used to control invasive species, depending on the species, but usually it's done in combination with other practices. It can be used to control stand density, but it has its limitations. So you mentioned a lot of our forests are mature and you have big trees out there. Well, the kind of prescribed fires we do, by and large, have no effect on that large overstory density. And so if you need to lower that, you got to do it by thinning and timber harvesting. And so it's fire is one tool, and it's used often with many other tools. And the combination of tools and the sequencing of those tools and the timing of application are all really important and need to be responsive to your condition and your challenges on your specific sites. And that's something you have to understand and decide and spell out in your silvicultural prescription. I don't know where you guys are at, but I run into this attitude a lot in many places. For some reason, when I grew up, I thought much more broadly about silviculture than a lot of people do. To me, I manage vegetation to meet the landowner's objectives. If it's butterflies or flowers or veneer timber, you know, that's what guides my recommendations to the landowner. And I use anything I can to do that. But the attitude I've run into in a lot of places is much more narrow. Silviculture's, in some cases, silviculture is the timber harvest.
Right.
And, you know, and it's just trees, and that's all we're talking about. And so I think we need to move in a broader perspective, you know, and look at the entire ecosystem and how everything's connected and what the role of fire is in that. And I think it has a role, but it's not the silver bullet to achieve every objective.
Well, don't get us going, Dan. I see Brad over there on our Zoom call. He's just shaking his head.
That sounds so familiar, Greg. I mean, we've been having these conversations here the last couple of weeks, the exact same thing. Dan, I was going to ask you a question. So the other thing I've been seeing, and it sounds to me like this is probably easy, but if you look forward with climate change, a lot of our forecast, or maybe not forecast, but they'll say, hey, it's hotter and drier. This should be good for oak. But it sounds like unless we change dynamics, things aren't really going to change for oak.
Yeah, I am not a hardcore climate scientist, so I'm more of a dirt forester who understands. To me, my perspective of climate is it does affect vegetation and processes of ecosystems, but it does so over big areas, over big time scales, and in big ways. So it sets really broad boundaries on what species can exist somewhere, what species are best adapted to that and can, rise to dominance better. But humans are, like the main disturbance agents on Earth. And we have so much control over what vegetation develops and what species rise to dominance, and by either not doing anything or by intensive management. We have total control within these broad boundaries of climate. And so we have to pay attention and understand, climate and species requirements and relationships, the ecology or the sylvics of species, the interactions of plants and communities within climates, and if it gets hotter or colder, or if more of the moisture is in the winter or the summer, we have to understand how that changes the species competitiveness and its interaction with other species, or even how climate affects animals, and then those animals interact with vegetation for good or bad for the vegetation. So it's all connected. You have to keep an eye on it. You have to be looking down the road, because if what trees we're regenerating now could be there for 100 or 300 years, and it's like, what's the climate going to be then? I don't know, but we want to give it a good, best effort to understand it and plan for the future, and then just follow some basic good guidelines like diversity. The more diversity you have, the more the system is buffered against unknown future threats or changes in the environment or climate. But just because the sylvics of a species says it should do well in that area, it still has to colonize or get established on that site, and it still has to today compete with what's there and become dominant to be around in 100 years when the climate's really different and supposedly favoring it. So it is a challenge. I don't know. I can only imagine it's hard for landowners and managers to wrap their minds around that. Yeah. But
yeah, there's so many different topics that we could explore with you. And before we get any further, I want to just say, maybe in the future, Brad, we're going to have Dan back and maybe talk about, like, so you mentioned some of your work outside of like production timber management, so oak woodlands and savannas and that type of objective. And that's a whole nother world that we could talk about today.
Yeah,
I'd be glad to.
Yeah, just the ideas behind restoration, I think, are critical to forestry as we go forward. So I think it'd be a great conversation.
But kind of bringing it back to, where we started out today, talking about regeneration of oak for foresters. So what I hear you saying is that we need to think about oak regeneration more as this longer term process. We need to get into those stands early and start to monitor what's there for regeneration and assess what our strategy is going to be long term. And then we can start using our tools like playing with the light levels in the vegetation to stimulate and develop that advanced regeneration, because that seems like really the key that's been our mistake in the past, right? We just haven't thought about that until it's too late, as you said.
Yeah. And so you're right on. Just one other thing you made me think of is, if you don't have oaks, we got to get them established. So, maybe that's where you focus. What do I need to get them established? The litter layer is too thick. There's not enough light. I either need, do I have acorn production capacity in the overstory, or you can go in there and underplant, and that works really well. Artificial regeneration works well. The seedlings are, vulnerable to all the things that natural seedlings are, and initially even more so, because you put nursery stock out there and it's like ice cream cones in the forest for deer and rabbits. So there can be some added complications initially, but in terms of how a natural seedling reacts to changes in the environment to a planted seedling, it's pretty much the same. So what works for natural regeneration is going to work well for artificial regeneration. And it gives you a lot more control over the timing of things with your operations. I know that's a big logistical problem. You create the seed bed, the seed doesn't come, you lose the seed bed. You open up a stand, the seedlings aren't there, and so you lose the benefit of whatever silviculture you just did. And so you have more control over making sure you at least have oak reproduction on the site through artificial regeneration.
Yeah. Now we come full circle, because that Paul Johnson study you were talking about, or I was talking about here in the La Crosse area, that was an underplanting or post clear cut planting, and they basically found just what you said, that the planted seedlings work and they grow, but you've got to keep the vegetation. You got to manage the vegetation or you'll lose them.
Absolutely. And another thing to early on think about, which I just thought of, was invasive species.
Right.
And a lot of them, all the species are different, so you have to know what you got and understand its ecology. But a lot of them are adapted to disturbance. And a lot of them are, so the more you open up a stand, the more you're favoring them. A lot of them are adapted to fire. So fire alone is not going to control them. And you can make an invasive species problem really bad by starting your oak silviculture without dealing first with the invasive species. So that might even be the first step.
Yep.
is dealing with the invasives in your area and in the surrounding areas, and then move into just a logical sequence of, do I have oak seedlings there? Yes or no? What do I need to get them there? They're there, but they're small. They need more light. How do I do that? And just, work your way through the thought process.
Mm-hmm. And I like that idea of thinking about kind of controlling that light level in sort of sequences. So, as you said, the mid-story removal, maybe that's a stage, and then maybe you go to that seeding cut of the shelter wood to then start to get more growth on those seedlings and get that light level higher. Again, it just kind of goes back to that process thing, right? That we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, this has been great, Dan.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I know you guys are doing really good work up there in Wisconsin, so keep it up.
Yeah.
I just feel like this conversation, Brad, is, as I said, we got a ton more stuff that we could talk about.
Oh.
We have, a limited podcast segment. Otherwise, Haley's going to give us the big hook here.
And this conversation, we could be having we could be going all night and all day with this conversation, because there's just so much out there.
So we'll have you back again in the future. Otherwise, next time you're working up here with us, there is always the after hours silviculture conversation that can go on much longer.
Those are the best ones, Greg.
Yeah. Well, I've been honored and enjoyed, being a part of your podcast, and I'm always willing to, talk about other things too. And I learn as much in talking with landowners and managers as they might get out of me. So it's a personal benefit to me to talk with experienced, expert foresters like you all.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for working at that kind of that junction between research and the actual field foresters, because I think that's really, that applied work is so important, and that's what we need out here in the field.
Yep.
Thanks. Yep. That drives my life. That's my niche in the ecosystem.
That's right. Good niche.
Yep.
Thanks, Dan.
Yep. Thanks,
Dan. All right. Have a good day. Bye.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Silvicast. Want to stay up to date with Silvicast? Make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. If you have any ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, please let us know. You can reach us at UW-Stevens Point's Forestry Education and Development Initiative by emailing fedi@uwsp.edu. Feel free to include a sound file of your question, or simply leave a comment if you like. We learn best when we wrestle with questions, so keep them coming.
Thanks, Brad, and take care, everyone. And as always, thanks to our team. Haley Frater, our great editor, Noah LeMade, our IT guru, and our theme music by Paul Frater. And a special thanks to UW-Stevens Point's Forestry Education and Development Initiative. Have a good day, everybody.